So I'm presenting next, and I'm going to be presenting with some zines rather than with a presentation, so that screen's going to stay uninteresting for the next 20 minutes. Carl and Daniel have graciously offered to hand these out, and I'm going to ask folks to share so that we don't run out, so one for 2 people I think should work. If you would like one and did not get one to keep, then please just feel free to Slack me, and I will make sure that you get a paper copy. So to start off, hi, I'm Heather Rosenfeld. Some people also call me R2D2 or Dr. D2. I'm a lecturer in environmental science and policy at Smith College. Over the last few years, I've been developing and teaching courses in practice-based critical cartography and GIS. To start off, I think everyone has zines or shared zines at this point. Yay! So to start off, I want to ask folks to raise your hand if you have made a map outside of a classroom situation. Cool, a lot of people. Okay, so keep your hands up. So keep your hands up now if you received, if that map was graded. Yeah, so very loaded question. Just to raise the point that we don't receive grades outside of class for the most part. We don't receive points outside of a classroom situation for the most part. Grading is a very specific thing that gets used in education and that doesn't need to get used in education. So I'm going to ask folks to turn to the second page of the zine now to get into it, where I just want to introduce sort of the landscape of sorts of grading, where traditional grading is seen as usually all there is if you don't know more than that. And traditional grading has a lot of problems to it. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is research-based, and some of the resources at the end will get into that in more detail. And so one of those problems is that traditional grading, points and grades, thwarts intrinsic motivation. So rather than being motivated to learn, students become motivated to optimize a score. Traditional grading also promotes this kind of policing and punishment mentality where you're being evaluated on the basis of compliance as opposed to learning. Research has also shown that when you give students feedback in addition to a grade, which I think in a cartography situation a lot of people are doing, but research has shown that students will often just look at the grade and not look at the feedback. And then one of the other huge issues with it is that traditional grading exacerbates and reinforces the structural biases already in education, so race, class, gender, ability, and more. And so there are a few alternatives to traditional grading that are out there, and I'll be talking specifically about ungrading. And so if you could turn to the next page of the zine. So what is ungrading? In most of the institutions that we're at, there are a few exceptions out there, but in most institutions, students are still going to receive a final grade for a class because that's how things work these days. So that still happens. However, the emphasis on grading is reduced as much as possible. So students don't receive grades or points for assignments, for participation. There is a lot of structured feedback. There's an emphasis on formative feedback, so feedback that can be applied in future work, including especially in that class. And then students will also self-evaluate and assign themselves grades or suggest grades for the class, for the final grade, not for all of the assignments. And so what I really want to emphasize is that ungrading is not primarily about a lack of grades, but that it's a different system. And I've been teaching with ungrading for 4.5 semesters now, including 2 semesters where the classes were very cartography oriented. And so I'll be talking about how I ungrade, recognizing that there are many other approaches out there. And so one of the first pieces is just a lot of instructor and peer feedback. And as an instructor, I try to distinguish feedback that is relatively more normative, so a projection that's centered on the other side of the world, a label that is placed a little bit too far from text to be legible, an accessibility issue in terms of color or something. Relative to feedback that's more primarily subjective, so things that I think would be cool, like, hey, it would be great if you added more orange here, or something like that. Pretty subjective. And I recognize that this distinction is false in many ways, but it does give students some flexibility in thinking about feedback and more agency, in that if students want to, I encourage students to accept the normative feedback more, in that if they want to not go in that direction, they can, but they should have a good reason for that. Whereas if they don't want to add more orange, they don't want to add more orange. That's fine. And then the peer feedback. And often the peer feedback is before the map is due, or when they'll have another draft after. And a lot of that is, if anyone's taken an art class, sort of similar to the walk around the room and look at other people's maps. And then students will give each other ideas, and they'll start copying each other in really productive ways. So things like adding a text box, things like sharing with each other on how to do different things, finding tutorials, many of which were created by people in this room, but finding them and sharing them with each other. So next page. Next piece of ungrading is self-evaluations. And so the self-evaluation method that I use is inspired by Jesse Stommel, and someone who's ungraded for longer than I have. And I've done it via a Google form or on paper. And so these aren't all of the questions that I use, and I'm happy to share the form. But a lot of them are things like, what are you proud of? Where are you struggling? Also things like, what do you do when you're struggling? What else do you want to cover, especially for the mid-semester evaluation? And then what grade would you give yourself and why? And the reason for these is partly a check-in in general. It's also designed to encourage what's known as meta-cognition, so reflecting on your learning. Some people will learn really well through following a very detailed step-by-step tutorial. For some people, that won't work. For some people, they like videos. For some people, they like me or someone else to show them how to do something. And so thinking about what works for different people. And then there's a sort of bonus, which I hadn't planned for, which is with that what are you proud of question. I write reference letters for many of my students who take my cartography classes, and that what are you proud of is a really good signal of, oh, this would be a good thing to include in a reference letter. And so it kind of does some of that work. And then the next piece of ungrading for me is mini conferences. And these are 2 or 3 times in a semester. Mid-semester and end of semester is what I've done. I've started doing a beginning of semester one where there's not really a form, but it's sort of a check-in, get to know you, what are your interests. But a big part of it is talking through the self-evaluation. And some of that is to troubleshoot things, to go over issues. If someone doesn't know how to do this one key thing in ARC or Illustrator or QGIS that's really tripping them up, then we can troubleshoot that then and there. Another piece of that, though, is to check in about grades, because even though we're taking away this grades orientation, students still have anxiety about grades because they want to do well in class in a way that is, unfortunately, the way that institutions measure things. And so it's a way to say, hey, yes, this is how you're doing, or check in some other way. And that's part of what the mid-semester evaluation does. It's not most of what it does. Most of it is that deeper checking in about the self-evaluation and going over things, but part of it is just that grades like stamp of this is where you're at. And then another piece of that I've found really valuable is offering suggestions. And that goes in both directions. So I can help students figure out other ways to to improve when they're struggling. But they'll also offer suggestions that I've taken. So one student asked for an Illustrator cheat sheet of a lot of the common tasks that we use. And yeah, it was a great idea, and so we did that. And it's something that now I can implement in the future. So the offering suggestions, again, is something that especially goes both ways. So for the next couple minutes, I'll talk about why to ungrade. So I recognize that this is based on my personal experience and that a lot of the classes that I've taught or all of the cartography classes that I've taught have had a critical approach already. So students aren't focusing entirely on that technical skill building. There is a lot of that, but there's also reading about things like guerrilla cartography and resistance mapping and things that other folks in this room do, and talking through that. So one of the reasons for ungrading that I found is that it offers multiple pathways to success. So students come into the class with different priorities. A lot of them have to do with map making, but in different ways. Some students are really interested in certain kinds of styles. Some students are really interested in certain kinds of ideas, and so on. And so multiple pathways to success with ungrading are built in, as opposed to something sort of added extraneously. And this contrasts with Paulo Freire's, a radical educator's, banking model of education. So students, rather than being sort of empty vessels that get then filled with knowledge, who can then press buttons and make maps, they come in with interests, they come in with ideas, they come in with skills that they're then able to work on and then also share with one another. Another reason to ungrade is that it promotes thoughtful risk-taking. So in response to a bunch of readings on the colonialist and militaristic legacies of cartography and GIS, one of my students asked, hey, should we make ugly maps? And that is such a rich question that I think that some of the later sessions will be discussing in more detail. But just asking that question and then thinking about, okay, like I'm gonna try to make an ugly map was amazing and something that you probably wouldn't think about doing or be encouraged to do in a traditional cartography class where you need to tick off these boxes. And then another former student of mine, after the mapping class, did a senior project on a book of chemistry's monsters. That was also a zine, involved a lot of visual storytelling, and so that kind of thoughtful risk-taking that can be really transformative. And next page, please. Another reason to ungrade is that it promotes what I call technical community care. So community care, supporting one another, but especially in a situation where you're learning a technical skill, you get to copy techniques and have that be encouraged. You get to ask and show each other how you're doing things. And I think that that's especially helpful in this pandemic age where we've all been so isolated, and what I guess think of as a reparative culture of technical community care, I think is so valuable. And one other thing about ungrading, one question that I've gotten is, oh, but won't students just give themselves A's and then slack off? And I found the opposite to be the case. More often, things like the mid-semester and end-of-semester check-ins become an opportunity to dismantle imposter syndrome. Students work very hard, and then they grade themselves, when it gets to that grading part, more harshly than I would otherwise have done when I'm switching to grades mode for like the few minutes that I'm like, we need to have this grades conversation. And then I see that they've graded themselves more harshly than I would have. So it's not the give themselves A's and slack off situation. So for the last couple of minutes, I want to recognize a few limitations to my version of ungrading, of which I think there are still some solutions. But I've been really lucky to have very small class sizes, so less than 15 people for both of my cartography classes. And so my version that involves these one-on-one meetings and things like that works really well. It could be honestly exploitive and an overwhelming amount of work for a cartography class that involves 80 students or something. Another limitation of ungrading and other efforts to democratize education is that as an effort to democratize education, the labor falls disproportionately on instructors who are minoritized, marginalized, otherwise in precarious situations. In terms of things like students making requests, asking for those extensions, asking questions, asking for flexibility, all the things that we probably think are good, but should not fall primarily on female instructors of color as opposed to white male instructors, to just give some axes of difference. Another challenge of ungrading is the depth of the grades orientation that we have. And so we've been all socialized into this policing mentality, into this compliance mentality, do the thing and you get the points. And that's internalized by students, but it's also internalized by instructors and administrators. And so it's not simply switching the structure, it's also working on challenging our habits and challenging our thinking patterns. However, I want to say to all of these limitations, I think the solution is actually more ungrading. So ungrading by faculty who are not in precarious situations. Ungrading by folks teaching larger classes who can figure out what are the solutions. And to that, Jesse Stommel's website and blog has a lot of ideas already. But more ungrading, I think, is a great solution to normalize it and then figure out solutions. And so I wanted to offer a few references to learn more. And so that's on this last page. And I also want to end with an invitation for you all to try ungrading. And that could be the full semester ungraded. It could also be something like an early assignment that's not graded. It could also be something like an activity where students self-assess if you're not ready to go full semester. And so that's all I have. Please feel free to reach out. I am not super active on Twitter, but feel free to reach out there. Otherwise, if you have questions beyond the Q&A, feel free to contact me, Twitter, or email. That's all. Yeah. All right, so we have time for a few questions. Since I already know you, Daniel, I'm going to go with the other person who I don't know. Can you say your name also?
Yeah, I'm Belle.
Hi, Belle.
I love the presentation.
Yay.
When you were talking at that point about students judging themselves, I was kind of wondering that, because so in cases where it's students' first experience ever being non-graded, and they're kind of used to this whole sort of linear punitive.
Yep.
And, how are you, what happens in sort of managing their own self-anxiety and still kind of wondering, okay, well, if I'm not being graded, then, sort of all that internal pressure, what happens? Can you just talk about what happens, in that situation?
Yeah, and let me know also if I'm going in a direction that's less what you're looking for. So some of it is, or some of it I think is addressed through students seeing each other's maps. So seeing that they're, for the most part, all roughly on the same page. All of them are having the same struggles in Illustrator or Arc or QGIS or whatever it is. And they're not the same, but they're all making cool maps in some way. And so that's where some of the validation and some of that comes in. Seeing the anxiety is through conversation with students and through some of the feedback that I do. At the beginning of so the first time I did ungrading, I didn't know that there was a word called ungrading, and I had heard about feedback instead of grades being something that is done. And I asked my students, I gave them a piece of paper where I asked them to write how they felt about trying this out, recognizing that it would be pretty experimental on my end. And then I also offered the idea of that mid-semester check-in to mitigate that grades anxiety, and I think about 2/3 of the students were like, yes, please, let's do that. I think that would help. And then the other students were like, yeah, whatever, it's all good. I'm not worried. And I envy those students who do not have that kind of anxiety. But yeah, so a combination of checking in with folks. which is very much tied in with the relationship building that a small class enables also. So, yeah. Daniel, and then we might have to wrap up for now. Yeah.
Basically the same thing. I will add, though, that when I've deviated from the traditional model, sometimes I've had students who are sometimes confused by the idea that I don't want to have an adversarial relationship with them.
Uh-huh.
They're just so drilled into them.
Yeah. Yeah, so if everyone starts doing that, then eventually we will conquer the adversarial model. Yeah, so thank you all for coming.